Now, in a stunning development, al-Shabab militants that control parts of Somalia where famine has been declared are reversing a previous pledge to allow aid agencies to return to areas the agencies were expelled from last year. The al-Qaida-linked rebels imposed a ban on food aid in 2010 and, according to the UN and the United States, is partly to blame for the current disaster. Al-Shabab had promised to allow relief agencies to have access to territory under its control. Meanwhile, the World Food Programme says it will start airlifts within days to Mogadishu. Prior to this latest decision by al-Shabab, the WFP was preparing to open up a number of new routes by land and air into the famine zone. The WFP wanted to establish the necessary operating condition for the relief effort, including those that will secure the safety of aid workers. Josette Shiran, WFP Executive Director, commented from a feeding center in Mogadishu.
I've met here today people from all over southern Somalia, and there's no food where they are. And what we've heard from them, I just heard from one woman who's lost 3 of her children. And so we're calling on the world to really back operations to scale up very quickly to reach those in the epicenter in the famine conditions in southern Somalia. It's very dangerous and risky, but we have to reach people. They're not making it all the way here to Mogadishu. These are the ones lucky enough to make it here, and even these feeding centers are overrun.
Shiran calls on global bodies to supply fortified food. Over 130,000 Somalis have fled their country since January, mostly to Kenya and Ethiopia. Hundreds of Somalis are arriving in Ethiopia and Kenya each day. There are now 1 million internally displaced persons, or IDPs, living in camps in and around Mogadishu. Today, IDPs account for nearly 1 in 8 Somalis. Somalia is now facing the worst drought in 65 years. Fighting between the UN-backed transitional federal government and the al-Shabab Islamic group has made conditions even more perilous for the country's refugees. David Axe has that story for us.
Every morning, Fatuma Adan Ali ventures into the neighborhood of Afgoya on the outskirts of Mogadishu to beg. If she's lucky, she'll return to the IDP camp where she lives with 4,000 Somali shillings. It's just enough to buy a few bananas that she divides among her children.
We are hungry. We are hungry. We are very hungry. Can't you see how the children physically look?
Ali is just one of nearly 1 million refugees crowding a chain of camps lining the road between Afgoya and central Mogadishu. The displaced persons have been driven there by war, repressive policies, and drought that has steadily worsened. With its expanse of open land and within reach of Mogadishu's seaport, Afgoya hosts the majority of the country's IDPs. Somalia had one of the world's proportionally biggest internal refugee populations even before the current crisis. Including those with homes but short on food, more than 1/3 of Somalia's population depends on some form of assistance from the UN and aid groups. A full half of the dependent population lacks permanent housing. 20 years of fighting have all but destroyed Somalia's economy, disrupted agriculture, and created a long-term refugee population that ebbs and flows with the fighting. The UN has backed the transitional federal government based in Mogadishu in an attempt to establish nationwide governance, but the al-Shabab Islamic group controls most of Mogadishu and southern Somalia. Periodically, al-Shabab has banned the distribution of food aid in the territory it controls. That policy has driven tens of thousands of people from their homes towards areas controlled by the TFG, a process that accelerated when the TFG launched a major offensive in March. Halima Abdikader Yusuf fled the lower Shabelle region outside Mogadishu and settled in an IDP camp in Afgoya.
No humanitarian agency could come to help us because the humanitarian agencies were banned by the radical Islamist group.
The ongoing drought is another factor. Rainfall has steadily decreased over the last decade, with drought conditions reaching a new peak this year. With more farms failing and tens of thousands of people leaving their homes, in early July, al-Shabab said it would allow the UN to resume food deliveries in the group's territories. But even where aid groups are unencumbered, theft and corruption can divert food shipments away from the needy. The diversion of aid inspires frequent popular protests by community leaders and refugees alike. often directed at the UN and aid groups that have had difficulty controlling their own distribution processes.
If you are recording for the international aid agencies, let them not deliver any humanitarian assistance to these people. Let them have their so-called humanitarian assistance.
Fighting between the transitional federal government and al-Shabab has slackened in recent weeks, amid a TFG political crisis revolving around the prime ministership. That, plus al-Shabab's lifting of the aid ban, could reduce the flow of refugees toward Afgoya. But the underlying conditions of drought, conflict, and poor governance continue undiminished, and that means continuing deprivation for one of the world's biggest and most desperate refugee populations. David Axe for VOA News.